I'm Chris Hunt with Hatch Magazine and Hatch Adventure Travel, and we are hosting tonight a live webcast with our good friends at the School of Trout. Many of you know the folks who are visible on the screen on my right. We got Todd Tanner, who is the head of the School of Trout, in addition to being the head of Conservation Hawks. We have Tom Rosenbauer, a longtime employee at Orbis, and he's much more than an employee now. He's an icon. Sorry, Tom. And he is one of the more outgoing professors, if you will, at the School of Trout. And then finally, we have John Juracek, a renowned casting instructor and also a professor at the School of Trout. Tonight, we talk about dry fly and dry fly fishing. The School of Trout, as many of you know, and some of you don't, offers a couple of classes this year. Our dry fly class is happening in the summer, and toward the end of summer, and then our Dow of Trout School of Trout class takes place at the end of September at Harriman State Park. Both of these are happening in Island Park in eastern Idaho on the renowned Henry's Fork of the Snake River. And all three of these guys will be at those seminars. And if you're interested in attending or learning more about how to attend, just visit the link there at the bottom, and you can always catch us at Hatch Adventure Travel at hatch.travel. And I'm going to start right now with the head of the school, so to speak. Well, and let these guys introduce themselves. Todd, I'm seriously limiting you to 90 seconds. Todd Tanner, who's the head of the School of Trout, he's going to take it and go from here.
Okay, thanks, Chris. And John and Tom, good to see you guys. I guess we're going to talk about dry flies tonight, which is one of my favorite subjects. What I've noticed over the years is that there are far fewer dry fly anglers than there used to be. When I started getting really serious about fly fishing back in the 80s, it seemed like everybody was dry fly fishing. And now it's one of those things where it just doesn't seem like many folks are out there casting a dry fly. See a lot of folks nymphing, some folks throwing streamers, not too many people casting dry flies. And the thing I would like to point out right off the get-go is that there's one reason to fish dry flies above everything else, and that's because it's so much fun. I literally can't think of anything that's more enjoyable on the water than wandering out with a dry fly and finding a rising fish and picking that specific fish and making a cast. And I hope that you all get a chance to enjoy that you all get a chance to sneak out this spring, this summer, get a little dry fly fishing in. And that's just what I wanted to start things off with. Chris?
Thanks, Todd. I appreciate that. And I, maybe it's a generational thing. I'm not sure what the logic is, but you're right. I'm seeing fewer and fewer dry flies and more folks watching bobbers than I ever have before. Tom Rosenbauer, I'm going to turn it over to you for a few seconds and let you kind of explain what you're up to these days and how you're involved with School of Trout and how dry fly fishing is important to you in your own personal angling.
Well, thanks, Chris. It's fun to be here with my pals from the School of Trout. It's one of the high points of my year. I really have so much fun at the School of Trout, and our students are wonderful. It's just a great time. What am I doing now? Well, I'm doing kind of the same stuff I've been doing for quite a while, doing podcasts and writing books and making videos, basic how-to videos, and working a little bit with our social media people at Orvis. That's pretty much it. And I'm sure there's other things that I can't remember right now because it's 8:00 here in Vermont. But why do I enjoy dry fly fishing? Well, it's really, to me, it's the essence of fly fishing because you don't have lots of extra junk to worry about. You don't have a lot of fancy knots, and seldom do you fish two dry flies, although it's perfectly reasonable to fish two dry flies, and a lot of people do it. I think a single dry is often the way to go, but everything is visual. It's you, and you know what you're doing. I mean, there's a fish there, right? With nymph fishing or streamer fishing, you don't always know there's a fish there. You know there's a fish there. You know it's feeding, and you got a puzzle in front of you that you need to solve, and that's what fly fishing is all about: is cracking that code, solving the puzzle. So the fact that everything happens in front of you, not underneath the surface, is it just makes it. Anytime you can sight fish, I think it raises the enjoyment level of fly fishing when everything's visual. Is that enough?
Absolutely. Thanks, Tom.
I could keep going, but
I know, and we will get back to you. I'm confident. We'll get back to you. And last but not least is my friend John Juracek, fellow Yellowstone area angler, renowned casting instructor, and yes, a professor at the School of Trout. John, take it away from here and tell me what you know about dry fly fishing.
Well, dry fly fishing, I agree with what Tom said there, and I think so many of us feel the same way about the visual aspects of it. I dearly love watching insects drift down a stream, watching fish rise, watching my fly drift over that rise, wondering, having that sense of anticipation. Is this the cast that I might catch a fish on? I love that part of it. But another part of it I especially love that tends to get overlooked is the casting. Okay, I think much of the time we view fly casting as merely a means to an end, a way to deliver our fly to the target, and that's it. But I submit there's much more to be had from that. There are very real tactile pleasures to be had in good fly casting, and I want to celebrate that. Casting a single unweighted fly is really, as Tom said, it's the essence of fly fishing. And I think that tends to get overlooked these days, and I don't want it to. I think we should celebrate that part of it. Because if you think about it, in the final analysis, it's the casting. That's the one thing that separates fly fishing from other forms of angling. So I want to embrace that. I want to enjoy it. I want to celebrate that part of it as well.
So,
John, I had a dream last night.
I'm sure you did. Can't wait to hear about it.
It's an inside joke, by the way, from the School of Trout.
That's a horrible inside joke. So, just before we dive into questions, we had a video to play, but we had some technical difficulties, and I don't think we're going to be able to show the video of the School of Trout. What we will do is we'll put that up on the Hatch Magazine and the Hatch Adventure Facebook and YouTube channels and Twitter feeds, so you can take a look at it post presentation. It features John casting, and pretty much made me, just watching it made me hate him more than I already hate him because he's such a good caster. But I wanted to just acknowledge that. And then maybe just a quick question that I'll start it off with, and then we'll dive into some questions from the gang. When you all were learning to fly fish, was the dry fly the first thing that your mentor, your father, your grandfather, whoever it was, your aunt, your uncle, tied on to your tippet, or was it something else? And let's start with you, John, since you're right there.
Well, when I began fly fishing, yeah, I think the sport more or less centered around dry fly fishing. I think that the other forms of angling, nymph fishing in particular, at that time, were something that we did at times when we were not fishing to a hatch or fishing dry flies blind, for instance. It was sort of a side technique. And we only did that when the fish were not available to be taken on a dry fly. And sort of same thing with streamer fishing. And these days that's changed, of course. Nymph fishing, streamer fishing have become much more prominent as methods of starting out with your fishing on a day-to-day basis. But yeah, for me, definitely dry fly fishing was first and foremost when I started out.
Todd, how about you? And I've literally seen you force feed fish dry flies on the Missouri. So you're going to be your answer might be a little different.
So, Chris, I didn't have a mentor when I started fly fishing. I had been doing a bunch of spin fish, and I was really serious about it. And so, for me, dry flies were like this weird, mysterious thing that I didn't know anything about. So I started focusing on streamers because it was as close as anything I could find to what I was used to with throwing a rooster tail or a Meps or whatever. But really, really quickly, I figured out that streamers were not ideal for a fly rod. They're fun, but they require an awful lot of effort. And just out of sort of nowhere, I realized, wow, this dry fly stuff is crazy. It's a ton of fun. and it just sort of hooked me. It was one of those things where I literally tried to step back from it. I don't want, I shouldn't focus on this, but it was just, man, it was so enjoyable. It was like, I have no choice. I've just got to, I've got to fish dry flies because it just puts this great big smile on my face.
Tom, how about you? What was when you first started angling? Was it the dry fly or was it something else?
Well, I didn't have a mentor at all, Chris. I'm self-taught and learned on a local pond that had mostly small largemouth in it, little tiny 7-8 inch largemouth that I sight fished. It was kind of a clear pond. And yeah, I started out with dry flies, those plastic imitation grasshoppers. But then when I finally did find a mentor, he was a guy that had a fly shop in the area. He was a nymph specialist. And so when I started seriously fishing for trout, I did a lot of nymph fishing, but it wasn't tight lining. It wasn't indicator fishing. It was floating line straight upstream nymph fishing with fairly heavily weighted flies. But so it was kind of different than what people do today.
Okay. Since you're still on the main screen, I'm going to dive into some questions, and Tom, we'll start with you with this first question from Dan Doffel, that came over to us prior to the broadcast. What is your favorite hatch to fish, and why?
Well, Dan, I think my favorite hatch would be the little blue wing olives with people, you might have heard them called Baetis. That's the genus of a mayfly, and it's the most abundant mayfly in the world. It lives just about everywhere, nearly every continent where there are cold water streams, and I like it because the fish respond to it really well. They usually hatch in pretty good numbers, and the hatch lasts for a long time. It's one of the first hatches we see in the spring, both here in the East and in the Western United States, first mayfly hatch. But you'll see them in South America. I've never fished New Zealand, but I know they have them there, and England they have small olives, and throughout Europe. So they occur everywhere, and it can be a frustrating hatch because the fish tend to like to eat the emergers, and I like frustrating hatches. I like it where I have to think and I have to futz around with a couple of different fly patterns to get the fish to eat it.
Excellent. All right. This question comes to us from Michael Chaddock, and John, it's for you. Here's the question. I've tried all kinds of floatant. Seems like none of them work as advertised. Is there a special way to apply it that will keep the fly drier, or do you just need to apply it after several casts or after catching a fish?
Well, thank you for that question. And you're not alone there. I don't think any of the floatants out there work as advertised. That said, there are a lot of floatants out there, whether they're gels, pastes, liquids, sprays. All of them these days are just fine. I don't think any of them stand head and shoulders above any of the others. I'm using a German floatant called Miracle Floatant right now. And trust me, it is not a miracle. But it works fine, just like all the available floatants work today. I would caution you to, or at least counsel you to think about it this way. I think the fly is more important than the floatant you're using. When it comes to dry flies, I want to think about my fly as being tied with materials that will float well, in the proper amount of materials on that hook, and in the proper order. I want to make sure that the fly is what really floats and not so much rely on any given floatant to keep it up. Because if you've got a fly that is too sparsely dressed, or maybe dressed with materials that don't really want to float, no floatant is going to make that thing ride on the current. So I would think about that way. In terms of using them, one mistake I see maybe is that people tend to put too much floatant on a fly, and that can mat the materials down and actually make it sink much more readily. So go very lightly on the floatant. I always put floating on to begin with when I'm starting out. Once I've either caught a fish and or my fly's finally gotten drowned and needs to be dried out, I'll bring it in, dry it off. And at that time, I'll probably use some sort of desiccant on it to really get it dry. I might then just fish with the fly from that point on, or maybe, not usually, but maybe I might put a little bit more of a gel floating over the top of that as well. So think more about the fly. That's really where I think the most valuable part of flotation comes from, is how that fly was tied, what it was designed to do, what materials went into it. And that's more important than the floating in my mind.
Yeah, I would agree. The desiccant at the end of the day seems to be more. I use it more than I do the floatant at the very beginning. I tend to powder it dry more than I tend to gel it dry. Anybody else want to jump in on that one, or are we good with John's answer there?
Who's going to argue with John?
That's unlike you.
All right, this one comes to us from Richard M. Allen, and this one's for you, Todd. And I think here everybody, because I would imagine we might get 3 different answers, which would be pretty cool. Todd, what knot do you typically use to tie on a dry fly?
Chris, what I tend to do, or let me back up just a bit. I believe that Tom and John both use a clinch knot. And I thought to myself, I can improve on what those guys are doing. So I went with an improved clinch knot. And that's what I fish with dry flies, 99% of the time. The one point that I would say that I think John and Tom would probably echo is that go with a knot that you're confident in. If you believe in a knot, if you're quick with it, if it's something that you feel good about, that's the knot you should use, rather than trying to change things because of something that somebody else tells you to do. So,
yeah, good answer. John, is he right? Are you a clinch knot guy?
I am a clinch knot guy. Yeah. The only other knot I occasionally play around with is what is called these days a double davy. And I will use that. It's got a very small profile. I don't think that's a huge matter, but sometimes I will tie that or use that knot. But most of the time, it's a clinch knot, straightforward clinch.
How about you, Tom?
6-turn clinch knot, not improved.
There you go.
Period.
End of story. Gotcha. Okay. This one comes from my buddy Drew Youngdyke up in Michigan, and it's for you, Tom. I'm really close to getting a new rod for mostly wading small to medium Northwood streams and rivers, lots of tree canopy for brookies. What are the best dimensions? 4 or 5, 8, 6, 9 feet, medium, fast? Why might I choose one or the other? And what does that 4 inches of difference make, if at all? Will one help with roll casting more than the other? So several questions there. Hope you can break that down. If you need me to repeat it, I will.
No, I saw it before, so I'm familiar with it. Well, let's tackle the line size first. And if you're mainly fishing smaller flies, I'd say 12, 14 and smaller, and you don't have a lot of wind, then I'd go with the 4. With your tree canopy, you probably don't have big windswept areas. If you tend to fish some bigger, what are called attractor flies, chubby Chernobyls and big wolves and stuff like that, and you want a rod that you can also throw nymphs and streamers with occasionally, then I'd go with a 5. But there isn't a ton of difference between the two. And then between 8.5 and 9, it's said that longer rods roll cast a little better. And I think that's true. And it's also said that I've heard this before, that for accuracy and the way the physics of a fly rod, fly line system work, 8.5 foot rod is supposedly the most accurate. So, and I would not shy away from fishing a 9-foot rod on a small stream. You can hold more line off the water. You can mend a little bit easier. You can roll cast. But the 8.5 footer, I think it's a toss up. if you never plan on fishing bigger rivers, then go with 8.5 footer. If you might go to a bigger river where there's more wind and bigger flies, then I'd go with the 9 footer. As far as action's concerned, it's so subjective, but I can't stand fast action rods, and I don't see any use for them other than occasionally in salt water with a heavy wind. But I don't care for fast action rods. I don't like the way they feel. I don't like the way they cast. I consider them kind of show off parking lot rods that are generally underlined anyway. So
Interesting. Okay. Glad this thing isn't being recorded.
why? I would say you can record it. I would say that to anyone.
Teasing. John, I just want you to kind of take the same question. You fished a lot in and around Yellowstone National Park, big water and small water. Take Drew's question and apply it to Yellowstone in more of a Rocky Mountain setting. How would you answer that question?
Well, again, it really boils down, I think, to the size of the water you're fishing. In the Yellowstone area, we have a lot of small water, but a lot of that water is fairly wide open. And so we don't pay a penalty to have a long rod, a 9-foot rod. Bigger water, of course, a longer rod can be very, very helpful. So in general, almost all my fishing is done with a 9-foot rod. I have some 8.5 footers that I also use, but most of my fishing is more 9-foot oriented for any number of reasons: casting distance, mending line, manipulating it, distance. All of those factors come in, but you can't really go wrong if you're going to be fishing wide open areas with a 9-foot rod. If you're going to fish a lot of tight quarters, yeah, then a shorter rod will definitely come in handy, especially if those tighter quarters are brushy where you don't have a lot of room to maneuver.
Okay. Let's see here. John, while you're still there, this one's for you. Last year, this is from Rick Jorgensen. Last year, I started playing around with sunken trico spinner patterns. Can you share your thoughts on fishing sunken spinners? Do you still need a drag-free drift?
Sunken spinners. When I hear that, the first thing I think of is our old friend Sylvester Neames, he of soft hackles fame, who wrote a lot of books about fishing them. He also tied a lot of sunken spinners that he fished on the swing. And I would always sort of challenge him, Sil, do you really think that those fish are taking your sunken spinner as a spinner, as it's swinging? Because that sort of defies the behavior of natural spinners, right? When spinners come back to the water, they're more or less at the mercy of the currents. They're either dead or dying. So they're subject to the whims of the current. So yes, you can fish a spinner swung and sunk. I have no doubt that fish are taking some natural spinners underneath the surface. Why wouldn't they? But as far as whether they're taking it on the swing as a spinner, I have a lot of doubts about that. So I think if you are going to fish a sunken spinner, I'd be inclined to fish dead drift first and foremost, because that fits in with the sort of regime that a natural spinner is going to do. It's just subject to the mercy of the currents. So I'd fish it dead drift, but sunken spinners, of course. I fish them a little bit with Baetis, because some Baetis species actually lay their eggs underwater. But I have never come across a need for a sunken spinner. And when I have caught a fish on one, I could never be certain that it was actually taken as a spinner.
Chris, you're muted.
Sorry, guys. I was trying to keep the background noise to the minimum. Todd, this one's for you. It comes from our mutual friend, Chad Schmuckler. He works with me at Hatch Travel and is the editor of Hatch Magazine. Over the years, I've gone from learning dry fly fishing as something one does by casting upstream to preferring to fish dry flies downstream most of the time. What percentage of the time do you fish dry flies upstream versus downstream?
That's a good question, Chad. I would say, Chris, that it's going to depend almost exclusively on the situation I'm in. There are, I look at it like every time I'm on the water, there's an optimum angle or an optimum position to approach those fish from. And if I'm seeing a rising fish, I'm making all sorts of calculations like, where am I going to get the best drift? Where's the fish least likely to see me from? Where can I wade? Where can't I wade? Are there obstructions in the way? I'm looking at all those things. I would say in general, I probably, if I can approach from anywhere, I would prefer to approach from up and across. So I'm upstream of the fish and a little bit across current rather than directly upstream. If you wade in directly upstream from a fish, the current will bring down, silt, potentially plant matter, all sorts of different things, and alert the fish that there's something going on. So given my druthers, I like to fish down and across to rising fish. Probably the single biggest reason for that is I don't have to put my fly line and my leader over top of them. The first thing that they're typically seeing is the fly. And we're making a cast, usually in those situations called a reach cast. John may end up, or Tom, waxing eloquent on this later, but it gives us the option of putting all the line back upstream of the fly, and then the fish only sees that fly. So we're not as likely to spook it with the leader or the line crashing into the water and hitting things heavily. So I would say 60 or 70% of the time I'm fishing down and across. I don't know, Tom or John, how you guys approach things.
I'd love to hear what both of you guys have to say about that one. Particularly John, because you and I fish a lot of the same water, and I tend to go all over the map on where it just depends on where I'm standing and where I see the fish. But I'm not sure how you would approach something like that. How you prefer to fish dry flies to trout.
It depends, just as Todd said, on the nature of the water. If the water is small, I like to fish straight upstream to fish, come right over the top of them. And if I have the option on bigger water, I tend to fish across and downstream much more often. But I am never afraid of coming upstream right over the top of the fish. I don't usually fish upstream at an angle. If I'm fishing upstream, I'm generally coming right over the top of the fish from straight below him. But on a bigger river like the Henry's Fork or the Yellowstone or the Madison in the park, I tend to fish more across and downstream there.
Okay. Tom, I've got a question for you that you're absolutely going to love, and I can't wait to hear your answer to it. This is from JC Combs, and the question is, I love some tips on making my own leaders. Most of the time they're great, yet some aren't as smooth to cast dries with. It's likely me being stubborn about having to perfect something more difficult. I've looked up so many combinations, it makes me a little flustered. Can you take it from there?
Well, cheers to you for building your own leaders, because I think you learn so much about how leaders work, and I think the leader is I think the leader is one of the most important pieces of the package that you use to present to a trout. And Chris has quoted me before. I think I said once around a campfire with a few too many drinks that I'd rather wear somebody else's underwear than use somebody else's leader, because it's so critical. And what I would advise you to do is to get to some place where the water's smooth, where you can see the leader landing, and actually make a 20-foot cast and actually observe the way the leader is straightening, and see if it does it kind of pile up in one place. Does it kind of jump back and pile up? In that case, you probably need a longer transition section in that area. Does the tippet lay out the way you want it to? I mean, sometimes you want the tippet to land in loose coil. Sometimes you want it to straighten out. Depends on the situation. But I would try various formulas and then just play with them. Your own casting style might dictate the right leader design for you. And of course, it's going to change. If you're casting short versus long, the right leader taper might be different. Windy day versus a calm day, a big fly versus a small fly. So I don't think there is one. I don't think there is one universal leader that you can use. I typically start with a 9 or 12-foot 4 or 5X knotless leader, and then build from there. I may extend it out with some transition sections and a lighter tippet. I may extend the butt section if I want a longer leader, if I think I'm spooking fish. But I think it's that transition. There's a long butt section that's fairly level and it's very stiff. And there's a long tippet section that's level and very flexible. And that in-between part, those transitions between the butt and the tippet are probably the most critical piece. And I usually leave that alone in the knotless leaders that I use. But I think you can monkey with both ends of the leader and modify it based on the situation.
Excellent. I knew you'd have a good answer for that. John, this one's for you only because you are the casting guru. That yours is the voice I hear in my head when whenever I make a wind knot. And Jed Zamp lives in Casper, where the wind never stops blowing. And his question is, oftentimes I struggle with wind knots while throwing anything and or hitting the exact area I want to. Any tips for that?
Yeah, wind knots. Well, I'm fond of telling people there are two ways to find out if you can really cast. You go out and you cast long, or you go out and you cast in the wind. In either situation, there is very little margin for error. You're going to find out right away if your stroke is solid or not. So if you're struggling in the wind, especially with wind knots, that's a sign that you probably have some sort of structural flaw in your casting stroke. And without actually watching you cast, I can't sort of really pin down what that might be. But I would suggest this. One, look at the video that is going to be attached to this talk, because then you're going to see someone casting with a mechanically sound stroke. And look at that stroke and sort of compare it to yours. See what you might be doing differently. But if you're getting a lot of wind knots, especially when it's windy out, that's a sure sign there's some sort of structural flaw in your stroke, and that would need to be addressed. You need to get mechanically sound. And if you are mechanically sound, then the wind in many situations is just rendered largely irrelevant. Good fly casters can handle an incredible amount of wind without any issue. So if you are struggling in it, I'd have someone take a look at your casting stroke for you and see if you can't become a little bit more sound there.
That's good advice. Really good advice. I'm trying to think. We've got a few here that I'm pushing through. Oh, here's one for Tom that I'd love to hear an answer to. And this is from Ed Engler. Tom, what's your favorite dry fly river in the East? And then as a follow-up, a subtle follow-up, what's your favorite dry fly river on the whole planet? Ed doesn't have too much information there.
Ed must never have listened to anything I've said, because I hate naming my favorite anything. But in all fairness, I don't really have favorites of anything, flies, fish, rivers, but I would say for the best dry fly fishing over wild trout in the East, it's probably going to be the Delaware system. And I hate to, it's not exactly hot spotting because it's not exactly unknown. But anywhere in the Delaware system, the east and west branches, the Beaverkill, the Willowweemock, they all have tremendous hatches, mostly wild fish, particularly in the Delaware part of the system, the tailwater part, and they're consistent hatches, and they're large trout. Now, that being said, it's no secret in these days of the internet, and they're very crowded. In the world, I would say from what I have seen, and I'm not a world traveler like Jeff Currier, one of our other instructors, but I would say that it would be either the Henry's Fork or the Missouri, because that both rivers have profuse hatches, predictable hatches, lots of high density of trout. And I tend to lean toward the Henry's Fork just because the Missouri River has gotten too crowded for my taste. I just can't take it anymore. There's just too many anglers on that river for my taste, anyways. I don't like to talk to people when I'm fishing. I don't like to hear other people yelling when I'm fishing. So the Henry's Fork, you can it's a little easier to get away from the crowds there.
I totally get that. Todd, I'm going to ask you a question. I probably should ask Tom because he just did a video on this, but I want a different perspective, and then maybe Tom can chime in, and so can John afterwards. Double dry rigs. Do they up the chances? Is it a numbers game? Is it a dropper thing? A drowned trailer? Does it decrease drag, twisting, etc.? What are the what's good about fishing a double dry rig? I think you're muted, buddy.
Okay, I'm gonna probably annoy some people. There's nothing good about fishing two dry flies together. I literally can't think of a situation where it's going to improve my angling or make me happier. So, I fish, if I'm fishing nymphs, I fish two nymphs frequently, assuming that regs allow that. You go up to like British Columbia, you can't fish two nymphs or two dries. But with dry fly fishing, I want to put the fly in a very specific place. I'm focused on where that fly lands and how it drifts. So if I have two dry flies landing next to each other, what happens is they do this. And one is almost always dragging the other as tension goes between or relaxes between the two flies. I do know folks who like to fish a large dry fly and a small dry fly together so that the big dry fly is sort of a sighter, and they can say, okay, I know the little fly is within 18 inches or 2 feet of that. So if I see a rise near the big dry fly, I'm going to set the hook. And I understand the logic to that. But after spending time with anglers like Tom and John, what I can tell you is if you're a good enough caster, you know approximately where your fly is anyway, unless you're casting 18 feet liters in a heavy wind, you know pretty much where things are. So I would suggest that people don't fish two dry flies together. I know I'll get a lot of pushback on that. That's my personal opinion after fishing dry flies more often than I probably should have through my life. So yeah, I'd love to hear what Tom and John have to say.
Yeah, Tom, you just did a video for Orbis on that very topic, and I'd love to hear your perspective on it. I think it's probably a little bit different than Todd's. Maybe not. Maybe there's some common ground there.
Yeah, I think there's some common ground. I love dry dropper fishing, which is what I do. If there's nothing going on and I'm prospecting, I'll put a dry and a nymph on together. And that's kind of my go-to. But I was down in Chile recently at Magic Waters, and by the way, there are some of the finest dry fly fisheries in the world there as well. Not as many hatches as the Henry's Fork, but you could blind fish a dry fly and pick up fish, left and right. And one of the guides was fishing. The fish were eating hoppers, and they were eating hoppers a lot. And one of the guides was suggesting, and he told me that he does this a lot, was to put a swall, like a size 20 parachute Adams, behind the hopper. And I thought blind fishing with a 20 parachute Adams doesn't seem like it. Doesn't just there were no fish rising or something. It didn't seem like it would be something to try. But I did it because he suggested it, and he's a good angler. And by God, I started catching more fish on the little parachute Adams than I did on the hopper. And so I guess I became a believer in that. But the fish in Chile are very dry fly oriented. I find they're very surface oriented. But that being said, I agree with Todd. If I see a fish rising, I'm going to take off that second fly. If I'm in a hatch situation or I see a fish rising, I want to be dead accurate. I don't want to have to worry about drag. And with 2 flies on there, chances of screwing up, not putting the fly exactly where I want it, or getting drag right I want it are, I think, increased. So as soon as I see a fish rising, that second fly is coming off. I only use it for prospecting when there isn't anything going on.
Good, thank you. John, this next one's for you. From Chris Shelke. Simple question, probably a simple answer, but I'm going to let you go with it. How far do you have to be able to cast to be a successful dry fly angler?
How far do you have to be able to cast? Well, I'm just going to throw out a range here and then qualify it. You need to be able to cast between 10 and 50 feet. And that's measured from where you are standing, from your feet, not from the end of the rod, but from where your feet are. You need to be able to cast between 10 and 50 feet. If you can do that, you're going to catch fish on dry flies almost anywhere in the world. A couple qualifications here is one, of course, depends on the size of the water you're fishing. If you're fishing a small stream, odds are you're not going to be casting 50 feet. You might be casting more like 10 or 15. On big water, if you're trying to hit a spot you can't wade to, you might have to cast 50 feet or whatever. The other sort of facet that comes to mind here is, how stealthy are you as an angler? Are you someone that has the ability to creep up on a fish unnoticed and remain unseen, create very little waves? You can get pretty close to fish. If you can't do that, then you're probably going to have to cast a little bit further without spooking the fish. So again, I think if you just can cast accurately and consistently between 10 and 50 feet, you're going to be good to go pretty much anywhere in the world for dry fly fishing.
Good. All right, Todd, this next one is for you, and it's from my buddy Mark Payne in Tennessee. Other than throwing your rod and going home, any advice or techniques recommended for fishing the dreaded no-see-em, usually a size 24 dry or smaller, tiny flies?
Yeah, I think it all sort of ties together, Chris. And hey, Mark, I hope this proves helpful. When you're fishing very, very tiny flies, there are a couple of tricks that can be helpful. Be really locked in on your leader length so that you know exactly where your fly is landing, because you're not going to see the fly. Keep your cast as short as possible. Don't cast further than you have to. If you can get away with a 25 or a 30-foot cast, that's what I would do. It's just going to make everything simpler. In my mind, the biggest issue with fishing, what the old timers used to call minutia, isn't that you can't see the fly. It's that you can't tell if it's dragging. The fish are going to know that. They're going to see it. You know, they're eyeballing it from inches away. If you've got drag even on a little tiny fly, chances are they're not going to take it. So you need to do everything you can to put yourself in a position to get a good drag-free float where the fly is floating as if it's not attached to anything. So if you focus on a drag-free float, and try and say that 3 times fast, and make sure you're dialed in on how long your leader is. You know exactly where the fly should be, and keep your cast short. I think those 3 things are probably what I would consider to be the most important things with fishing really, really tiny flies. Tom, you fish little dinky stuff in the East, I'm sure. I'm in Montana. Do you think that I missed anything there? What else would you add to that?
I fish more dinky stuff in the West than I do in the East. Yeah, I think that the short casts give you a chance to maybe see your fly. And you know, the other thing is often when the fish are on tiny flies, they're eating midge pupae. I mean, if it's a 24, it's probably a midge, unless it's a little pseudocleon or it's those little pale olive mayflies. And you know, don't get hung up on catching the fish on a dry fly. try a pupa, midge pupa just under the surface or in the surface. I find that because that's the most vulnerable stage of a midge's life cycle. And I find often that just going to a fly that's just in the surface film or just under it will be better than, and there you can't see your fly anyway. So you look for the swirl and you set the hook when you think it's in the vicinity.
While I got you there, a quick question from Rick Jorgensen on leaders and tippets. How critical are leader length versus tippet length?
That's for me.
Yep.
I think that there's two different scenarios here. Leader length is really important when you're trying to keep your fly line away from the fish, because the butt section of a leader lands a lot lighter than even a 2-weight line. There are a lot more waves thrown up when a fly line hits the water than when a leader butt hits the water. So if the fish are spooky, then leader length is critical. And tippet length is, I think, super important when you're trying to avoid drag. Most knotless leaders come with about a 20-inch section of tippet, and I think that's way too short. You're trying to reduce the influence of your leader and your fly line on the fly's drift, and the longer the tippet, the more fine diameter, lower mass material you have out there, plus a longer leader generally lands in loose coils, and those have to pay out in the current before your fly starts to drag. So I think if drag is an issue, the tippet's critical. If spookiness is an issue, then the entire length is critical.
Excellent. Thank you. John, this one's for you because it's regionally specific. Have you heard, and this is important for anyone who wants to come to the Yellowstone area, have you heard how the Yellowstone River and the rivers in the northern third of the park have recovered or are recovering after the big flood last June? And how is this going to impact that area's prolific hatches?
Well, I don't think we're going to know exactly until the season opens this year. I can tell you that the northeast corner of Yellowstone, Lamar and Soda Butte last year, Slough Creek, once they did open in October, they fished quite well. And I know a lot of people are concerned about what happened up there, and that was some really, really serious flooding all the way down through the Yellowstone Valley. But I think one thing we have to keep in mind is that both fish and fly life have evolved over time to deal with conditions like that. They might not happen all the time every year, but the fish and flies are pretty hardy, and they can figure out ways to survive that kind of flooding, and they do survive that kind of flooding. Insect hatches, insect species in the right conditions can rebound very, very quickly within a year or two. Fish not that far behind. So I think given good conditions, in a couple of years, for sure, we're not going to notice much difference. Obviously, the habitat will be different. We'll be fishing different runs, different looking water. But just in terms of survival of fish and fly, I think we're going to be in pretty good shape, given good water conditions.
Okay. Living here in the area too, it was jarring to see what was happening. I've never seen anything quite like that. And I had a hard time imagining how it could happen. And then watching it, literally take houses out on the Yellowstone below Gardner was just jarring. That's the best word I've got for it. And there were a lot of people who were affected by that flooding, and a lot of people who were in the fly fishing industry who were affected by that flooding and lost guide days and lost time. So as we all think about how to decide whether or not to go back and fish the Yellowstone sometime, maybe think about some guide relief donations to various nonprofits out there that are put in place to help some of these folks who really lost a little bit of their livelihood last year thanks to these floods.
Chris, can I make one quick comment here still?
Yeah, please do, John.
Yeah, I'm also, this is just purely anecdotal, but the people that I know that fished the Yellowstone down in Paradise Valley and below towards the end of last summer, I don't think that was quite as good. It didn't seem to recover as quickly as the headwater streams like Lamar and Soda Butte. So I'm not really sure how that's going to fish this year. again, I'm optimistic for the future, but this year I think we just have to wait and see.
Yeah, I wish I had like you. I kind of wish I had a crystal ball and knew what it would look like. I mean, if you saw video of that, or even just still photographs of that water coming down, that's Noah's Ark stuff, man. It was nuts. Yeah. Couple more quick questions, and then we're about to hit an hour here in about 5 or 10 minutes, and we'll decide if we want to keep going. Let's see here. This one's from Chris Elbow. I think I'm going to let Todd take this one since I bugged Tom with enough leader questions. Leader and tippet can still spook a fish, though. Yes. Do you not worry about dropping your leader or tippet over a fish?
I don't worry about dropping my tippet over a fish. What I don't want to do is either false cast over the fish because the fish will either see the line or the butt section of the leader, or line spray can be an issue in that situation. And I definitely don't want to put the butt section of the leader or the line over the fish. So that's one of those things where every situation is a little bit different. I would assume that we're talking typically about casting straight upstream, like John was talking about earlier. He does a lot of dry fly fishing from below, especially in small streams. So if I'm in that situation, the thing that I really need to focus on is exactly how much line I have out. And can I land that dry fly the correct distance upstream from the fish without spooking it? So the deeper the water, the further upstream I need to land the fly in order to give the fish time to react, to see it and react to it. Yeah, if a fish is in 4 feet of water and I put a fly 18 inches above him, chances are he's not going to see it in time and be able to take that fly, certainly not without turning around and following it downstream. If I'm fishing relatively shallow water and, maybe the water's 12 inches or 16 or 18 inches, putting a fly 2 feet, 2.5 feet above the fish is not an issue. And I'll agree with Tom. Most of the prepackaged leaders that you buy, the tippets are a little bit too short. So if I'm fishing upstream, I would add, maybe I would probably cut my tippet back a foot, 16 inches, 18 inches, and then tie on 3 or 3.5 feet of tippet so that I end up with a longer leader. And that light tippet is much less likely to impact the fish. It's not likely to spook him in comparison to, say, the butt section of the leader or especially the fly line. So hopefully that helps.
Yeah. Following up on that, this is just a sort of the natural progression on that. And John, you can jump in on this when Todd's done. Give us some advice for fishing longer leaders, say anything, 15 feet ish. Sometimes, a lot of anglers, especially if they are, the small stream creek freaks that really don't necessarily put a lot of time or thought into leaders, suddenly find themselves, say, on the Rio Corcovado in Argentina, and their guide hands you a rod with 18 feet of leader. What do you do?
You learn to cast. Okay, that's the single most important thing with fishing longer leaders. My experience, and I don't know if this is universal or not, is that people, and for those of you who don't know, I used to guide on the Henry's Fork and the Madison and the Yellowstone. So I have a little bit of background with watching other people fish. And my experience was that competent casters, and I don't mean exceptional casters, but competent casters can typically handle a 12, a 14, even a 16-foot leader as long as the wind isn't severe. People who cast poorly or who haven't put an awful lot of time and effort and practice into it can't handle longer leaders. So, the one thing I would say, you can cheat a little bit and say, I'm going to make my butt section longer and stiffer so that it acts more like a fly line and the leader is in essence functionally shorter. But in general, just practice your casting. Get out and practice. And we tend to recommend that folks, if somebody puts in 10 minutes a week for 3 months or 6 months, they will become a far better caster as long as they're adhering to sound fundamentals. So yeah, I would love to hear what these other guys have to say about that.
Yeah, John, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. Coming from a casting instructor, that those longer leaders prove baffling for a lot of anglers. What do you think?
Yeah, they certainly do. And one of the reasons for that is the longer your leader gets, less margin of error you have in casting it. You have to have a very refined stroke to cast a very long lead. And if your stroke is not really refined, you're going to struggle with it for sure. So again, just like Todd said, it comes back to casting. If you have a sound casting stroke, you can cast a long leader with no problem whatsoever. If your stroke is not sound and you're trying to cast a long leader, you're going to find out right away, right? You're going to struggle with it. And that's just a sign telling you that, hey, there's something going on in your casting stroke that isn't quite right. You just have to be very precise with a long leader. You need a solid, mechanically grooved stroke. So if you are struggling with something like that, it's time to have somebody take a look at your stroke and see if it can't be improved.
Good. Okay, Tom, this one's for you from Ned Lundball. And the question is, do y'all think cutthroats or any other trout really sometimes just hit dries out of aggression and not to eat? I found that I have a harder time setting hooks on alpine lake cuts and on rivers. I was wondering if it's just me or if they're sometimes just smacking them.
I don't think trout ever eat a dry fly out of aggression. I don't know what would possibly piss them off with something floating over them. Large cutthroats are known to be very slow, methodical risers. And I personally find when I go from, say, fishing brook and brown trout and rainbows, wild rainbows here in the east, to fishing in the west, I have to slow down my hook set, particularly with big cutthroats. They just take a long time to inhale the fly. And I miss a lot of them at first until I slow myself down. So I don't think they're taking it out of aggression. They definitely think it's something to eat. That's why they're putting it in their mouth. I mean, they might take a streamer out of aggression, but I don't think a dry fly. So I think you just maybe need to hesitate a little bit more on your strike, or they could be refusing the fly. The fly could be too big and they're just bumping it with their nose. Sometimes the fish will come up for a fly. It looks good. And then when they get close, they say, that didn't look quite right. And they close their mouth, but they keep coming, and their momentum makes it look like a rise because they break the surface, but they actually never open their mouth. So it could be any of those things, but I think just slowing down a little bit and wait till you see your fly disappear in the fish's mouth will help.
Okay. I believe we have run out of questions for now, but we're scheduled for another 15 minutes or so. And
I saw one.
I
saw one about when do you give up on a little? At what point will you give up on something like a blue-winged olive based on size or light because you can't see it? I don't think we answered that one.
No, there you go. And it's I noticed I wasn't scrolling down. So why don't you take that one right off the bat? When you're fishing a blue-winged olive and it's just getting a little maddening. You're getting strikes all around and or rises all around, and they're not hitting your fly. When do you just say, to hell with it?
I don't give up. I try to get a little closer, try to change my angle a little bit so I can see a little better. But I'm not gonna. If fish are eating olives, I'm not giving up.
Good.
You're not gonna see those little tiny dark flies on the water, guys. You're just not gonna see them. Don't think that Todd or Chris or John and I always see our dry flies, because we don't. You just have to guess. And sometimes you strike to nothing, but that's, there's a cliche, hook sets are free, right? I hate that.
Hook sets are free.
But don't ever give up on them. Switch flies maybe, or switch your positions, or put a longer tippet on, but why give up when they're fish surface feeding?
There are a few more questions, and thank you for that, Tom. This one from Paul Snyder. Just how important is color or pattern in your opinion? I think the 2-color green and orange PMD spinners are killer. compared to a standard rusty, especially on the ranch, which is where the School of Trout is held, the Harriman Ranch, Henry's Fork, and the Harriman State Park, but not necessarily as important as presentation. Todd, I'm going to let you take that one since you're the Henry's Fork guru.
Well, I would say that, to my mind, presentation is the single most important thing. And after that, it would be the size of the fly, then the shape of the fly, and then finally the color combination. There are certainly situations where nailing the colors or let me put it this way, fishing flies that are a little bit different than what those fish see on a pretty regular basis, that can be effective on heavily fished waters. It won't make a difference in places where not too many folks fish. I sort of look at it like I want to have everything right. Okay, I want to make a good cast, a good presentation. I want that fly to be the perfect size for what I'm trying to accomplish there. That may mean it's the same size as the natural. It may be a little smaller, it may be a little bit bigger. I'll go back and forth on that. I want to have the right pattern. I have some patterns that are just, I have tremendous amounts of confidence in them. So I like that certain profile, depending upon what insects are out there. And color would be sort of the last thing for me. I'm more of a shade guy. If the bugs are dark, I don't think I want to be fishing a bright fly. Color would be the last thing. I'm not saying it's not important at times, but it's not typically the most important factor. I'd love to hear what John has to say about that.
Yeah, John, take that one. I would imagine that the word silhouette has to come into play here at some point.
Yeah, I'm not hung up on color at all, really. That's way down my list. Presentation first, fly size and silhouette, and color is just, I don't pay that much attention to it, really. I have to choose some color to tie my fly, so I try to match the insect I'm imitating. But in any given hatch, if you pick up 15 or 20 mayfly duns, they're going to be different shades of color, right? They're just not going to be identical. And a river like the Henry's Fork is notorious for that. You can have brown PMDs, you can have olive, yellow, orangish, and so to think that the color makes the difference, I just don't see that very often. I think much more important, of course, is presentation. That rules everything, for my mind. And one of the things that I think it's very hard for people to appreciate what can be accomplished with good presentation, because that doesn't translate well through film. Even watching someone in person, it's hard to tell. But when you're watching a truly skilled angler like Tom and Todd, it is amazing what you can accomplish with presentation alone. So that is always going to be first and foremost for me. And the exact fly pattern and, of course, its color are secondary always.
Yeah, good answer. And while I've got you there, because this is a Yellowstone specific question, no argument here as to the importance of stealth. This is from Craig V. Eggers. However, thinking, for example, of the Lamar River where elk and bison cross the river or drink at the river, do you think fish adapt to this and are less spooky and more tolerant of disturbance? Speak to stealth in general.
Well, with rivers like the Lamar and Slough Creek, for instance, Soda Butte, you're talking about Yellowstone cutthroat. And so they're a more tolerant fish. But just because they're going to tolerate your presence doesn't mean they're not spooked. They know you're there. They know they're being fished to. But they're not just going to run off and hide. Cutthroat are very interesting that way. So there's a difference there. And I always want to make sure that the fish, to the extent I can, do not know I'm there, right? That's always going to give you the best chance. But you look at the spring creeks around Livingston, Montana, for instance, Depews, Nelsons, Armstrongs. Hey, those fish are used to seeing anglers every single day. They are going to tolerate your presence, but they also know they're getting fished to. In other words, they're spooked. they're going to keep feeding, but they know they're being fished to and they tighten up a lot. So even on a river like that, I always want to try to minimize my presence. I want to make sure I can present my fly to them without the fish knowing I'm there. So I think stealth is very, very important. Even if the fish are willing to tolerate your presence, they're not going to be as easy to catch as if they don't know you're there.
Good. All right, Tom, this one's for you. It's from David Tarsi, and he wants recommendations on casting two men's in your line across two different current speeds. I could have gone to either all of the three of you for this one, but I've watched a few of your videos over the years with the Orbis video line, and you do tend to dive into some of these more complex situations. I'm wondering if you've ever done anything on this particular, two different current speeds, and then the idea of mending. Either think of it this way too. Also throw in the idea maybe of a reach cast versus a mend, or whatever you want to do. There you go. Sorry to overload you.
I don't have a clue how to cast two men's in one cast. I would change. First thing I would do would be to change my position so that I didn't have to cast over two currents. And I suppose you could do a reach cast in one direction and then do a quick mend afterwards. But as far as throwing two men's in one cast, only John can do that.
John, how about that?
The one thing to avoid men's entirely, just throw a ton of slack.
There you go.
Yeah, it's sort of interesting to consider what he's talking about here, but yeah, I went with Tom in there. So you could mend your line quickly, pause for a split second, then mend it again. And that would put two men's in it. You'd have to be very, very precise in doing that because you don't have a lot of time there as that fly line's unrolling. And I think under any circumstance, that's going to be a really difficult cast to control. And I side with Tom here. I'm moving. I'm changing my position. I'm going to find an easier spot that requires a simpler cast to make here.
Some of the best guides I've ever had have always told me before you change your cast, move your feet.
Yeah, that's great advice. Yeah. Try to find the best position. It's sort of like professional golfers, right? They can hit some unbelievable recovery shots, but they want to hit the easiest shot they can. Same thing for a good fisherman. We want to make our shot as simple as we possibly can, and we're going to move our feet to accomplish that to the extent we can.
Hey, Chris, can I weigh in on that?
Please, Todd.
So one thing I would suggest to folks who are watching this is that, it's not always about catching the fish. Sometimes it's just about what can we accomplish out there. And I love challenges. So I used to fish when I was guiding on the Madison. I used to fish up there a bunch. And there were places where there were two or three different currents that I was casting across to hit, say, a slick behind a rock in the middle of the river. And there was no way I could wade to it. And I could not get a better angle. And so what I would do is I would throw a reach cast, and then I would do an aerial roll mend on the back end of that cast to put more line in. And then I would use a puddle cast or a pile cast as part of that. So you've got literally three different things going on. You've got a puddle or a pile, you've got a reach, and then you've got an aerial mend before the reach settles. I would say that on average, I probably hit one out of three or one out of four of those where it worked pretty well. But it was fascinating to play around with. And so I would just encourage folks to say, yeah, I don't know if I can do this, but God, why not try? It doesn't cost me anything, right? I can, and maybe it's going to be a ton of fun. So,
well, if you were a baseball player, you'd be in the Hall of Fame. So there you go. One more from JC Combs, talking about a fishery that I'm fairly familiar with and have a love-hate relationship with, Silver Creek. When I see hatches so thick, there's no competition for food. What would you throw and why? I've taken photos of drakes 6 feet above the water, and they're so thick they literally curve with the shape of the water from afar. We're talking about one of the most prolific spring creeks in North America. And when a natural hatch is just so insane, That's the question. When it's so insane, what do you throw in hopes of convincing a fish to take a fly? And let's go with Tom on that one to start.
Well, the first thing I would do is pick one fish and try to get my fly in there as many times as I could. Just keep firing away as precisely as I could, so I get it in there when the fish, right in the fish's lane when it's ready to eat. And if that fails, then I'd put on a beetle. It sometimes works. You know, these fish that are keyed in on something, you just can't compete, and you slap a beetle down and they eat it.
Yeah, when you're in the midst of a blanket hatch, sometimes throwing something that doesn't look at all like what's hatching.
Yeah.
What the fish
Yeah.
Todd, what do you think about that question?
What I would try and do, and I agree with Tom right up until the beetle point, and I would probably fish an ant instead of a beetle. But the thing I would try and do is I would try and find a fish that had a particular rhythm. And if you can time a fish and say he's eating every 3 or 4 seconds or he's eating every 8 seconds, you can up your odds. You can't, nothing's perfect, right? But you can say, I'm going to put my fly 30 inches above that fish because that's the right distance for the water depth. And it's going to float down to him and it's going to get there in line with his rhythm. So I would say that ups my odds by maybe 50%. So that's the one thing I would say. John?
Well, I kind of agree with both of you guys. You know, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to accept the challenge that you talked about. And then I'm going to do what Tom said, is I'm going to cast repeatedly, precisely, and quickly. And I'm going to try to force that fish to eat my fly through sheer effort of the will and precision casting. And I'm going to give that a real hard shot because I think that's a good way to do it. But you got to be really precise with your casting, of course. If that does fail, yeah, I'm going to switch flies too. And maybe I'll put on, if we're talking brown drakes here on Silver Creek, maybe I'll just put on some big old whatever, another big old drake fly or something that is very large and obvious that's different than the brown drakes the fish is feeding on, and just see if I can't force them to take something like that too.
Yeah, most Adams.
Yeah, beetles and ants, of course, they work great too, and both of those are excellent ideas as well.
Good answers, guys. All right, we're getting close here. Last question. Jim Dawson, in the good old days, a yellow humpy, a renegade, and a royal wolf worked all summer long on the Madison. Not so much anymore. Is that because the catch and release guys have given every trout a PhD on that river, and they know what to eat and what not to eat? And I would expand that to say just about any, rather popular fishery coast to coast. 30, 40, 50 years ago, there weren't the numbers of fly fishers there are now, and those standby dry flies would work as Jim says all summer long. Now, not so much. What do you think about that? And are we victims of our own success here by using the catch and release technique to educate fish? Let's start with you, John, since it's Madison specific to start.
Well, I think there's some truth to that. One of the things we have to think about is that in any given river, there are certain fish that are going to rise and certain fish that are really easy to get access to. Well, guess what? Those fish see a lot of flies and they get caught a lot. Other fish aren't willing to rise and they're tucked away in places they're not going to be bothered. So we're fishing to a small subset of the population in any given river with a dry fly. And certainly fish can get used to being caught. They can get very leery of taking large floating objects. I would just tell Jim, hey, your yellow humpy is still a great fly on the Madison, but you're probably not going to get away with one in size 12 like we used to. Maybe you got to fish a 16 or an 18. And same with other attractor flies. Fish see large floating objects floating over them every single day of the year. They get caught on a lot of those, and they can become leery of them for sure. So it's a little bit different than it used to be. But it's not as if we are educating the fish in that sense. That smacks of Lamarckism way back in the day where, learned behavior is transmitted genetically, and we know that isn't the case. So I think it's just you're hitting a small subset of the population of fish, and they can get used to those flies.
Tom or Todd want to jump in on that one, or are we good?
I would just agree with what John said. Uh, Pat McCabe, who I've been fishing with for God more than 30 years now, uh, loves to fish little yellow humpies and does extremely well on them. I'd almost look at things from the opposite perspective. Some of those old patterns, and I'd love to hear what Tom thinks about this. I don't know, Tom, if you fish Catskill dries much anymore, but my experience is that some of the stuff that people have stopped fishing. When was the last time somebody fished Quill Gordon on the Henry's Fork? I don't know. But some of those patterns actually seem to be more effective now because everybody's not using them. I'd go fish a little yellow humpy or a little royal wolf on the Madison in a second this summer. What I wouldn't do is what John was talking about. I wouldn't fish it in a size 12 or a size 14. I'd drop down and fish a 16 or an 18, and I think I'd probably be pretty effective. Tom, what do you see with the old Catskill dries? Are you still fishing those, and are they more effective or less effective?
I think they're less effective than something like a sparkle dun or a compara dun or an emerger. But I do fish them because I like tying them. And there are times, windy days, choppy water, seems like a fully heckled dry fly like that will work okay. But I do think there is something to the fact that throwing a fly that's a little bit different than everybody else is throwing, particularly on rivers that are really heavily fished where they see the same imitations of a PMD or an olive. I think it's like with bass lures, the fish get conditioned to bass lures, and then they have to move on to something else. And I don't think it's that much different from trout. And if you want to fish big dry flies all day long to trout and not worry about it, go to Chile, because there's those fish will still eat a big dry fly all day long without any hesitation.
And if you are interested in fishing magic waters, go to Hatch.travel. We'll get you there.
Yeah.
We are out of time, and I've left a few questions unanswered, and I apologize. I'm glad that we had so many people stick with us through this, and I apologize to those few that we didn't get to. I wanted to end this really quick with Todd, just to talk a little bit more about the School of Trout and what's coming up. I know we have two classes, one in August and one in September. Todd, just really quick, and then we'll close off. Just talk about the differences between the two classes and largely focus on the dry fly class in August.
Okay, so yeah, we do have two classes coming up, Chris. I don't want this to be about this is our opportunity to give back to folks rather than trying to get folks to come to the classes. The dry fly class is about dry flies, everything. That's our focus I think we start on a Sunday and wrap up on a Friday. And, we are as intense and thoughtful and focused as we can possibly be with giving people everything they need to know to fish dry flies really, really effectively. The Dow Trout class in September it's more a foundational class where we're trying to give people the skills and the knowledge that they need to go from not fishing as effectively as they want to being more well-rounded and all-around anglers. The one thing I would say is that you don't need to go to a fly fishing school to learn how to fly fish. You don't need to go out with a guide. You don't need to go to a casting instructor to learn how to cast. But if you want to improve quickly and you want to get the most out of your time on the water, those can be effective ways to go. There's a lot of other great stuff. You can read Tom's books, which are exceptional, and you will learn a huge amount. You can go on the web and read good stories on Hatch or any number of other locations. There's actually some pretty good stuff on YouTube, and Orvis has a lot of good stuff on YouTube. But there is something to be said for learning at the hands of somebody who really knows what they're talking about. I started guiding fly fishing in more than 30 years ago. And I still learn from the other instructors at the school. I learn more about casting every time I'm around John. I learn more about entomology and fly choice and reading water every time I talk to Tom. I see these guys out there, and it's like it sort of boggles my mind that I've missed so many things over the years. And I think that we put the few people who come through and hang out with us for a week, we put them in a position where they can learn a lot if they so choose, but we can't create passion in anglers. We can't tell people, this is how you have to feel. That has to be something that comes from within. So we try really hard to find folks who are really enthusiastic about their time on the water, who have a super strong connection to nature and want to spend time learning things so that they get the most possible enjoyment. I mean, at the end of the day, fly fishing is really sort of silly, right? We spend all this time trying to catch these fish, and then we turn around and we let them go. And the only reason to do it is because we're having fun. It's putting a big smile on our face. I love it when people fish intentionally, when they say, whatever their reason for being out there, they say, this is what I'm trying to accomplish today. And they go out and they do that and they have fun. And I mean, I think it's an old Arnold Gingrich quote who said that fly fishing is as much fun as you can have with your pants on. And, I think that's probably true. I love standing in the water, waving a fly rod. And it gives me so much personal enjoyment. It connects me to the world around me in ways that I just don't get otherwise. And so I personally want to share that with folks. And I know John and Tom are passionate about their angling in their own ways. And it's sort of cool to have a place where folks can come and hang out and learn from people who really, really know their stuff and take something that's going to be with them for the rest of their lives. So that's pretty much what I have to say about that, Chris.
All right. Well, I appreciate that, and I very much appreciate the input from Tom and John as well. Guys, it's always great to see your faces and hear your voices. I know we don't get together as much as we would like to, but I'm hopeful that I'll be able to rub elbows with you a little bit this summer up in Island Park on the Henry's Fork. And listen, if you have more questions, please just put them in the chat on the platform that you're using. We'll send them around to these guys, and we'll see if we can't get some answers out to you one way, shape, or form. And hopefully, everybody gets a chance to have their questions answered by this crew, which is fantastic. And with that, I think we're out of time. We're past time. So let's close it down. And thanks again to all of you. And again, if you're interested in the School of Trout, go to hatch.travel/SOT for School of Trout, and we'll get you out there on the water this summer. Thanks all.
Great seeing you guys.
Thanks,
Bye,
guys.
everybody. Thank you.